The ambulance bay doors did not open gradually. They hit the wall at 3:41 in the morning with the sound of something that had been held back and suddenly wasn't, and Nina Cardwell looked up from her charting in time to see a man she had never seen before, carrying another man across the threshold like he weighed nothing. Which was impossible, because the man being carried was built like a defensive lineman and bleeding from somewhere under his left arm. No ambulance, no paramedics, no radio call ahead. The man doing the carrying set the other man down on the nearest gurney with the precise, practiced motion of someone who had done this before under conditions worse than a well-lit emergency room, then stepped back and said, "Gunshot wound, left shoulder, through and through. He's been unconscious for 11 minutes. Then a dog came through the door. Nina had been working emergency medicine for 6 years, and she had seen dogs in the ER twice. Both times small, both times with elderly owners who refused to be separated from them, both times manageable. This was not that. This was a Belgian Malinois in a tactical vest with a name tag that read Rebel in block letters, 90-some pounds of animal, moving with the deliberate economy of something trained to the edge of its capabilities, and it positioned itself alongside the gurney before anyone had taken a step toward the patient. The charge nurse, Barbara, who had been doing this for 22 years and was not easily rattled, reached for the gurney's handrail. Rebel turned his head. That was all. He didn't growl. He didn't lunge. He simply turned his head and looked at her, and Barbara stopped moving. "Get animal control," the attending called from the doorway. He hadn't come any closer than 10 feet. "That's going to take 20 minutes, someone said. "Then call whoever handles federal working dogs. This animal has a federal vest." The man who had carried the patient in, broad-shouldered, no insignia, the kind of fitness that wasn't decorative, said, "There's no handler available. I need someone to treat him now." No one moved toward the gurney. Nina set down her pen. She had been watching the dog since the moment it came through the door. Not with fear, exactly. With the specific attention of someone who understood what she was looking at. She moved to the left, away from the main group of staff, putting herself at the edge of the corridor where she had a cleaner angle to the animal. Rebel tracked her movement without changing his posture. She kept her hands at her sides, dropped her chin slightly, broke eye contact just long enough to signal she wasn't a threat, then brought it back. The dog watched her. She took one slow step toward him. Then she said quietly, "Clyd." The Czech command for easy, for calm, for I am not here to harm what you are protecting. Rebel's ears, which had been forward and rigid since he entered the room, dropped by a fraction. His weight shifted back off his front legs. And after 2 seconds that felt considerably longer, he stepped sideways from the gurney, not retreating, just permitting, and Nina walked past him to the patient's side. "He's tacky," she said, 2 fingers at the man's neck. "Heart rate's about 115. He's losing pressure. We need a line in now." Behind her, she heard the rest of the trauma team begin to move. The patient's name, she learned from the man who'd brought him in, was Travis Sewell. That was all the man offered before 2 people in plain clothes arrived through a side entrance and escorted him somewhere she couldn't see into. Travis Sewell was 37. He had the hands of someone who worked with them and the scar tissue distribution of someone who had been in bad situations more than once. The wound in his shoulder had been packed in the field with materials she didn't recognize as standard issue. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. The bleeding was controlled enough that it hadn't killed him, which meant someone had made good decisions in the first 10 minutes after he was hurt. She stayed in the trauma bay longer than her assignment required. She told herself it was the documentation. The handoff was complicated by the absence of any prior medical records, any explanation of how he'd gotten from wherever the injury happened to her ER at 3:41 in the morning. She told herself a lot of things. The truth was simpler. She didn't want to leave the dog alone. Rebel had repositioned to the foot of the gurney after the team took over, watching the procedures with amber eyes that moved from person to person in a systematic pattern she recognized as threat assessment. He wasn't interfering, he was logging, and occasionally, for 2 or 3 seconds at a time, his eyes would find her specifically, the woman who had spoken to him in the right language. and he would hold the look before moving on. She was checking the IV flow rate when the door opened and two people came in who were not medical staff. The woman was in her late 40s, close-cropped dark hair, the kind of eye contact that communicated authority without requiring an introduction. The man with her was younger, with a tablet under his arm and the posture of someone who had spent years making himself inconspicuous. Nina Cardwell. Yes. Special Agent Dana Forsyth, Homeland Security Investigations. This is Agent Rast. She showed the badge for 3 seconds. The man you just stabilized is one of ours. We need to ask you some questions. They used the family consultation room off the main corridor, the one with the uncomfortable chairs and the box of tissues on the side table. Nina sat with her hands folded and answered in the order the questions were asked, which was how she operated under pressure. Forsyth's first questions were clinical. Then she set down her pen and said, "You spoke a command to the dog, in Czech." "Yes." "That's not standard training for ER nurses." "No." "Where did you learn it?" Nina looked at her for a moment. "My father was Army K-9 Corps, Fort Huachuca. I grew up on post." She paused. "After I finished my undergrad, I worked 18 months as a civilian medical support contractor at a federal K-9 training facility in Virginia before nursing school. I know working dogs. I know what they're trained to accept and what they're not." Forsyth wrote something down. Rast finally looked up. "Rebel has worked with Sewell for 2 years," Forsyth said. "In that time, he has not accepted contact from a stranger without a direct introduction from Sewell. Tonight was an exception." A pause. "We're trying to understand why." "He recognized me as someone from his world," Nina said. "Not me specifically, the context I carry." Forsyth studied her with the evaluating calm of someone who had been assessing the truthfulness of strangers for a very long time. "That's a specific answer." "It's what I know." The interview ended at 4:30. Nina went to the break room, poured coffee she didn't taste, and sat at the table in the corner where a light had been flickering for 2 weeks and no one had fixed it. She thought about calling her brother Brendan, who had done 2 tours as a combat medic before his knee ended his service. She didn't call him. It wasn't too much yet. The shift change happened around her. She stayed. At 6:15, she was in the corridor outside the recovery room where they'd moved Sewell post-surgery when she noticed the man at the floor's supply station. He was in his late 40s, wearing the gray scrubs of the hospital's logistics department, signing into the floor's inventory terminal with the practiced ease of someone who belonged there. She had seen him on this floor twice in the past 8 hours, which was unusual. Supply staff made rounds on a fixed schedule. She pulled the floor's internal service log on her phone. Jerome Alcott, Supply and Logistics, signed in at 11:52 p.m., again at 3:10 a.m., now at 6:18 a.m. 3 visits to a surgical recovery floor between midnight and 6 in the morning. Supply runs did not work that way. She photographed the log entry, put her phone away, and walked calmly to the stairwell. She called the number Forsyth had written on the back of her card. Forsyth picked up on the second ring. "It's Nina Cardwell, Mercy General, 4th floor recovery. There's a supply logistics staffer who's accessed this floor 3 times in the last 7 hours. His name is Jerome Alcott. He went into the recovery wing about 4 minutes ago." A pause. Short, controlled. "Don't go near him. Don't let him know you've seen anything. Where are you?" "Stairwell B, 4th floor." "Stay there. 6 minutes." 5 minutes and 40 seconds later, 2 agents came through the stairwell door behind her. The arrest was efficient and quiet. Alcott didn't fight. He had the look of someone who had already done the math and understood that resistance was the variable that made everything worse. He was talking before they reached the elevator, low and fast, the words coming out in the tone of someone trying to establish cooperation before anyone asked. "I didn't touch him," Alcott said. "I wasn't going to touch him. I just needed to see the chart." Forsyth, who had appeared from the elevator 30 seconds after her team made the grab, said, "Stop talking," and he did. Nina watched them walk him out and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite relief. Alcott had the face of someone carrying something heavier than guilt, something closer to exhaustion, The specific kind that came from doing a thing you had told yourself was small and contained and had watched grow into something that was neither. She had seen that look before. She had seen it in patients, in family members. She had seen it in Brendan once, in the second year after he came home, when something he hadn't named had finally run out of room to stay unexpressed. Forsyth paused beside her as the team moved Alcott to the elevator. "I told you to stay in the stairwell," she said. "You told me not to approach him. I didn't." Something complicated moved across Forsyth's face. "Don't leave the hospital 45 minutes." In the consultation room, Forsyth opened a folder she'd been carrying and explained. Jerome Alcott had a clean employee record, 7 years, positive reviews, no flags. He also had a secondary phone with communications routed through an encrypted calendar application, and those communications connected to a company that hadn't logged any legitimate business activity in 14 months. He wasn't the initiator, Forsyth said. Someone reached out to him, pay per access. Every time he confirmed patient identity and room assignment for a name on their list, he got paid. She paused. Travis Sewell's name was on their list before he arrived here. Nina absorbed this, so they knew he was coming. They knew which hospitals served the federal facilities in this region. They had contacts in most of them. Alcott was their contact here. What were they going to do with the room number? Forsyth looked at her steadily. The same thing they do with any intelligence that tells them when and where a target is vulnerable. The implication settled quietly in the room. "You need to move him," Nina said. Moving a post-surgical patient introduces clinical risk. Leaving him in a known location after arresting the person feeding that location to a hostile network introduces a different kind of risk. She kept her voice even. Alcott is in custody. Whoever he was reporting to knows his window is closing. They're going to assume something went wrong. Forsyth's expression didn't change visibly, but something underneath it shifted. "What's your clinical assessment?" "He's stable. The shoulder repair was clean. He's going to have pain with movement, but the surgical work will hold if we're careful about how we transfer him." She paused. "I can manage the transfer. I'll authorize it." Moving Travis Sewell from the 4th floor to the 3rd floor's west wing took 9 minutes and required disconnecting and reconnecting 3 monitoring leads in sequence, managing an IV line that kinked at the junction, and keeping his left arm immobilized during the gurney transfer in a way the transport tech was not handling correctly until Nina redirected him quietly without making it a confrontation. Sewell was awake throughout. He didn't ask questions during the move. He tracked what was happening around him with the same systematic attention his dog used, eyes moving from face to face, cataloging. When Nina adjusted his arm position and he absorbed the spike of pain without making a sound, he looked at her afterward with something that was an assessment rather than gratitude. "You've moved patients under pressure before," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, still rough from the intubation. "That's most of my job," she said. "That's not what I mean." She checked his pulse by feel and didn't answer immediately. The contractor facility I worked at in Virginia, training accidents came through, occasionally. A few that weren't accidents. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said CLID to Rebel." "I did." He doesn't respond to that command from people outside the program. "I know." He looked at the ceiling. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, more like the recalculation that happened when a variable you hadn't accounted for turned out to be significant. "Your father. He trained dogs for 19 years. He died when I was 24. Still at Huachuca." She set her phone back in her pocket. "Some things stay with you longer than you expect." Sewell was quiet. Then, carefully, "I reported an information leak in my network 8 months ago. I was told I was misreading the pattern." Nina looked at him. "So I started keeping my own records." His voice was flat, past the emotion of it, into something more durable than bitterness. "Communication logs, operational discrepancies. 14 incidents where intelligence I'd provided was handled in ways consistent with prior disclosure to a third party. The shooting that put me here wasn't random. Someone knew my route." He shifted against the pillow, and the tightness came back around his jaw. "I don't know yet who's connected to what, which is why Forsyth knows the drive exists but not where. Why tell me? He met her eyes, because Rebel told me first. Her phone buzzed. The main security desk on the ground floor, unknown individual at front entrance asking for the nurse assigned to patient in room 412. Won't give a name. Security holding. Room 412 was Sewell's original room, the one they had moved him from 30 minutes ago. She stood up. Forsyth's unit, are they still on 4? Sewell was already reading her face. What happened? She typed the reply to security. Hold the individual, notify HSI immediately, release no room information, and then looked at him. Someone just walked into the front lobby asking for your nurse by your old room number, information that's 30 minutes old, which means Alcott reported it before we arrested him, and whoever received that report is now acting on what they think they know. She went to the door. The leak isn't just Alcott. Rebel was off the floor before she'd finished the sentence. She called Rast. Forsyth was 15 minutes out. She positioned herself in the corridor with sightlines to the stairwell and the elevator bank, her posture flat and professional, a nurse in her own hallway at the end of a long night. The man who came up the stairwell was wearing the green administrative scrubs of the hospital's facilities management department. He moved along the wall, rather than the center of the corridor, checking room numbers with the systematic patience of someone who had been given a specific number and intended to find it. Nina watched him from the alcove corner. She kept her voice barely above a murmur when she called Rast. 3rd floor west wing, green facilities scrubs, stairwell A, male medium build. He's on the floor right now. 60 seconds, Rast said. The man stopped outside the room 2 doors down from Sewell's, checked the placard, moved on, 1 door down. Nina stepped out of the alcove. Excuse me. Her voice carried the precise register of a nurse who belonged on this floor and was mildly inconvenienced by an unfamiliar face. Can I help you find something? He turned. He was better at controlling his expression than most people, but there was a half second before the neutral look settled into place, and she saw what was underneath it. Looking for a patient, he said, family. What's the name? A pause a fraction too long. Sewell. I don't have a Sewell on this floor. You'll want the main desk. They can direct you to the right unit. She held eye contact and did not move from the center of the corridor. He looked at her the way someone looked at an obstacle while calculating its weight. Rebel came through the door gap behind her. He didn't make a sound. He simply appeared in the corridor and positioned himself between Nina and the man in green scrubs with the particular quality of stillness that communicated more than any vocalization. The man looked at the dog. The performance on his face degraded. He took a step back, toward the stairwell, not the elevator. And then the stairwell door opened from the other side, and Rast came through with his credentials already visible. Federal agents, don't move. The man's name was Felix Straw. He had a paramilitary contracting history and a financial relationship with a consulting firm incorporated in Delaware that had no visible clients and had been registered 14 months ago by a man named Victor Lund. Rast explained this in the 3rd floor break room over a vending machine sandwich, efficiently and without editorializing, looking at his tablet rather than at her. She found this, for the first time, not irritating but reassuring. Some people were better at precision than warmth. In this situation, precision was more useful. Victor Lund was 63 years old. He had spent 21 years as a civilian contractor attached to the Department of Defense's Logistics Planning Division before moving into private consulting. A professional biography that described him as a defense systems specialist with cross-agency experience. He also had, according to communications recovered from Straw's phone, been in contact with a source inside the Federal Air Marshal Service for 22 months. The source inside Sewell's network, Nina said. We believe so. Sewell reported anomalies 8 months ago. The source has been active for 22 months, which means they were in place long before Sewell noticed anything was wrong. And when Sewell filed the report and was dismissed, the source would have known about that too. Rast paused. They weren't just compromising operations. They were building a targeting picture. Deployment schedules, movement windows, personnel availability. the kind of intelligence that tells you when a unit will be at its most exposed. Nina set the sandwich down. There's an operation they're positioning for. We think so. What we have now is Sewell's scripted drive, which Forsyth retrieved from a secured location 40 minutes ago, and which contains 14 months of documentation that Sewell built while continuing to operate normally alongside the person he suspected. She thought about what that required. The sustained daily performance of normalcy while carrying that specific knowledge. The discipline of never letting the suspicion surface in any way that could be read before the record was complete enough to be undeniable. Her father had told her once that the hardest thing about working with dogs was that they always knew when you were afraid, and the only solution was to actually not be afraid. Not to perform calm, but to find it. She had spent a long time thinking about the difference between those two things. The source, she said. Does Sewell know who it is? Rast was quiet for a moment. The drive contains a recorded conversation, names a civilian contact above the primary source. When Forsyth played it for Sewell, he identified the voice. He paused. Victor Lund giving specific operational direction to the source inside Sewell's network. Recorded 14 months ago, which means Sewell identified Lund as the origin point and built his documentation from there. He set the tablet down. When Lund's network realized Sewell was getting close enough to be a problem, the shooting wasn't reactive. It was surgical. They were removing a specific threat before he could bring a complete record to someone he trusted enough to act on it. Move on Lund tonight, she said. Forsyth is coordinating warrants now. The source inside the network is being arrested simultaneously at a federal facility in California. He looked at her. By the time Lund's network realizes what's happening, it will already have happened. It happened at 5:40 in the morning. Forsyth sent a voice memo recorded in what sounded like a moving vehicle, slightly compressed, highway hum underneath it. Nina. Lund is in custody. The source, a deputy director whose name will be in the public record by morning, was arrested simultaneously in Sacramento. The drive documentation was sufficient for federal warrants on both. The recording is clear enough that his legal team is already negotiating rather than contesting. A pause. Sewell wanted you to know before he heard it from anyone else. I thought you should know why. Then her phone buzzed from a number she didn't recognize. That should not have had her contact information. You gave them what they needed. Step back now, or this doesn't end with Lund. She looked at it for a long time. Then she forwarded it to Forsyth, got up, and walked back to Sewell's room. He was awake when she came in. Rebel lifted his head from the floor and tracked her across the room, then put it back down when she sat. Someone just threatened me, she said. Sewell was very still. Number? Unknown. Forwarded it to Forsyth. He looked at the ceiling. Something moved through his expression, cold and contained, the kind of anger that had already burned through the hot phase and settled into something more durable. Scared networks make threats and then calculate whether following through helps or hurts them. Threatening the person who already handed evidence to a federal agent after that agent already has warrants executing. He paused. The math doesn't favor them. I know. They want you to make yourself smaller. He turned his head toward her. Decide you weren't really part of this. Go back to being the night nurse nobody noticed. She thought about every time in the past 6 years she had been handed a version of that instruction. The attending who'd told her clinical instincts were good, but her job was to execute orders. The charge nurse who'd said she was too intense for the shift's dynamic. The administrator who'd told her the discrepancy she'd flagged in a patient's medication schedule was already being handled and she could return to her assignment. Step back. Her phone buzzed. Forsyth, message received, tracing now, do not engage, stay with Sewell. She put the phone in her pocket. The records you kept, she said, 14 months, while you were still working alongside whoever you suspected. Yes. What made you start? He was quiet for a moment. A safe house location that was burned 48 hours after I reported it through internal channels. The explanation was a surveillance failure on the ground. Explanations that make sense are easy to accept. By the third anomaly, I started writing things down instead of accepting anything. His voice was even, without self-pity. I had to keep operating normally. If I changed my behavior, whoever was watching would know I was watching back, every single day. She thought about her father in the kennel at Huachuca, working with animals that could read intention more accurately than most humans, learning to be exactly what he needed to be in every moment, because the dogs would know the difference, and so would whatever the dogs were trained to confront. The hardest thing is to actually not be afraid, not to perform calm, to find it. She had found it that morning at 3:41, in the 11 seconds between setting down her pen and saying a Czech word to a dog that was deciding whether to trust her. She hadn't performed it. She had found it, because her father had taught her where to look. The source, she said, the deputy director. Did you know? I suspected for about 6 months. The name on the recording made it certain. Something tightened briefly at the corner of his jaw. We worked a joint task force together 3 years ago. 14 days in the field. I don't know what the calculation looked like from his side. I don't think I want to. Your unit, she said. When this becomes official, when they find out what was happening from inside, it's going to be bad for a while. That's what it's going to be. He said it without flinching. I'm not going to try to manage it for them. They're going to need to be angry, and then they're going to need to work, and both of those things take the time they take. She nodded. That was the right answer. She recognized it because she had arrived at a version of it herself, years ago, when Brendan came home from his second tour, and she had spent 3 months trying to make his recovery smoother than it was, and he had finally looked at her and said, Nina, let it be what it is. She had stopped trying to fix it after that, and started just being present for it, and that had turned out to be the thing that mattered. The formal indictments were unsealed 4 months later. The press reports named Lund on 8 counts, the deputy director on 6. The plea arrangements for Alcott and Straw had been finalized weeks earlier. Their cooperation reflected in significantly reduced sentencing recommendations. The DoD released a 4-sentence statement acknowledging a breach in operational security and the successful identification and prosecution of responsible parties. It named no individuals. Nina read it on her lunch break in a small office at the federal facility north of Mercy General, where she had been working for 2 months on a protocol development role, specifically the gap in civilian hospital readiness for federally affiliated K-9 units and their handler. They came through civilian emergency systems without adequate contextual briefing for the receiving staff. The gap that had existed in her ER at 3:41 in the morning. The gap that Rebel had solved by making his own assessment with the tools he had when the system failed to give anyone else the tools they needed. She was building the architecture to close it. It was detailed, granular work. Nothing about it was dramatic. It was the thing you built in the quiet time so that the next time the doors blew open and the situation required someone to move, the person who moved had more to work with than instinct and accumulated proximity. She had been working on the K-9 Medical Integration Module, the section covering how civilian ER staff should approach a working dog in a handler-down scenario, when Forsyth appeared in her office doorway with an envelope. Standard white, unaddressed. From the director's office, Forsyth said, official commendation, your name, your specific contributions, everything from the moment you walked toward the gurney to the moment Lund's network lost its last moving piece. She paused. It's classified. It won't be public, but it exists, and anyone with the clearance to look will find it there. Nina took the envelope, held it. She thought about what it contained. Not the paper, but the fact of it. The formal institutional acknowledgement by people with the authority to make such acknowledgement means something. She thought about every time a thing she had done correctly had been absorbed into the general functioning of the team without attribution. Every time her instincts had been accurate and the credit had dissolved elsewhere. Every time someone had told her she was good, for a nurse, for someone her age, for someone without the specific credentials they'd expected. She had not walked toward that gurney at 3:41 in the morning to prove anything. She had walked toward it because a man was dying and a dog had made a decision and the situation required someone to move. I would have done every part of it without this, she said. Forsyth looked at her. Something in her expression shifted from professional to something quieter. I know, she said. That's the point. 3 weeks after that, Nina was finishing documentation on a pediatric patient, 7 years old, arm fracture, cooperative once she'd convinced him the X-ray machine was not going to hurt him. When the unit coordinator appeared at the nurse's station and said, in the careful tone of someone delivering information they weren't quite sure how to categorize, "There's a man in the waiting room, not a patient, says you'll know who he is," she knew before she reached the door. Travis Sewell was standing near the window in civilian clothes, moving better than his surgery had any right to allow. The left side still showed the compensation pattern. The bodies remembered caution around repaired tissue, but he was functional in a way that would have surprised anyone who hadn't seen what people could recover from when they decided to. Beside him, Rebel sat in his orange service dog vest, watching the room. Sewell turned when he heard her come in. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across a hospital gurney at 4 in the morning, like he was registering something real. "You look like someone who slept this week," he said. "You look like someone who followed his discharge instructions." Something almost a smile, most of them. They crossed the waiting room toward each other and met somewhere in the middle, which was approximately where a row of chairs had been arranged by someone who presumed people arrived already knowing what they needed, rather than finding their way toward each other gradually. Rebel leaned against her left leg. Not dramatically, not with the quality of a trained gesture, just the simple animal decision to place his weight against something he had decided was solid. She felt it through the fabric and didn't move away from it. She thought about her father, who had spent 19 years understanding animals that were smarter than most people gave them credit for, and who had told her once that the most important thing a working dog could teach you was this: knowing was not the same as trust, and trust was not the same as proof. And sometimes the most accurate read you were ever going to get on a situation came from the part of yourself that didn't need to explain its reasoning. She had listened to that part of herself at 3:41 in the morning. The courage wasn't in that corridor, though she'd needed it there. The courage was in every year before it, in refusing to make herself smaller in rooms that weren't quite sure what to do with the size of what she actually was. She looked down at Rebel, then back at Sewell, and she thought that some things, the important things, announced themselves not with noise, but with the particular quality of stillness that meant something had finally settled exactly where it belonged.